So I recently reread the Lord of the Rings books and read parts of the book for the first time, specifically the appendixes. And while I was reading through the appendices, I found some things that sparked my interest, and so I looked online a little bit, and I found some very interesting things out about Middle-earth, which I wanted to share with you today. Let's call this a little bit of a everything you didn't want to know about Middle-earth. Sort of helpful to a lot of this information is knowing a little bit about the background of why Tolkien wrote the books in the first place. Tolkien was really good friends with another fantasy author who really kind of defined the genre, C.S. Lewis, and both of them also were pretty devout Christians, and C.S. Lewis specifically did a lot of theological writing. But both of them saw this, what they saw as a problem in science fiction and fantasy, where it wasn't religious enough for them. A lot of the people who were writing science fiction and fantasy were people like Aldous Huxley and H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, who were really coming from more of a humanist perspective, and because J.R.R. Tolkien, more of a Catholic, C.S. Lewis, more of a Protestant, both of them wanted to contribute to what they saw as the solution of a problem, that fantasy and science fiction settings were very secular. It's a lot more obvious in C.S. Lewis than it is in J.R.R. Tolkien. His stories are practically allegory, which you don't see as much in J.R.R. Tolkien's work. In fact, J.R.R. Tolkien specifically says at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, in the prologue, that he did not write The Lord of the Rings with any kind of allegorical intention to it.
I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader and the other in the purposed domination of the author.
However, J.R.R. Tolkien did create a lot of backstory for Middle-earth, and what he ended up doing, because he was a Catholic, and Middle-earth is meant to be sort of a world that existed for our own, but in our own world, he put into it the ideas of the Christian God and the Christian Satan. He just sort of changed the words and made them more elfish. Now, he was creating his own mythology, and in most cases it's not as clear as X is Adam, Y is Eve, and Z is the apple in the garden. But in one case, there is a character who appears to be basically Satan. His name is Morgoth. Morgoth is the big bad in the Silmarillion, and he trains Sauron in how to be evil, basically. He schooled Sauron, and he is so much worse than Sauron. In Lord of the Rings, Sauron seems like the ultimate evil, but he does not hold a candle to Morgoth. The Silmarillion is, in part, an account of the war between the elves and Morgoth's armies. And just like Sauron, Morgoth was a bugger to kill. Unlike Sauron, however, Morgoth isn't dead. The reason, of course, that Sauron comes back in Lord of the Rings is basically the reason Voldemort keeps coming back in the Harry Potter series. The ring is almost like a Horcrux because it contains the majority of Sauron's power. As long as the ring exists, Sauron cannot completely die. And of course, at the end of the Lord of the Rings, Frodo destroys the ring, and Sauron is destroyed almost completely and will never be able to come back. However, the same is not true of Morgoth. Morgoth, rather than forging his power into a ring, forged his power into the entire earth. Which is why, no matter what we do, there will always be evil in the world, according to the Middle-earth mythology. So that's a depressing thing. Now that I've completely scared most of you away by talking about theology and the Silmarillion, we're going to talk about something that everybody can get behind: elf sex. Now, you may have noticed that Tolkien's elves are a little bit different from the elves you might find in your typical children's story, or your typical Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer movie, or your typical cookie box. The elves in Middle-earth really, for Tolkien, represented the ideals of humanity, and because of his Catholic worldview, again, that led to some very interesting ideas of how elves might get it on. And because elves are essentially immortal, for them, their sex drive isn't as strong as it would be for a human, because if elves did have the sex drive of a human and lived for several thousand years, Middle-earth would very quickly be overpopulated with little baby elves running all over the place. So Tolkien kind of set a cap on their reproductive span. Once they come of age at a couple hundred years old, they get married and have sex for a couple hundred years, and then after that, it's just kinda done with it. And live out the rest of the days almost totally celibate, singing songs and writing stories and whatever it is that people who aren't into sex do. Furthermore, for elves, sex means marriage, with no exceptions. Consummation of marriage is not the marriage ceremony, but the having of sex. Even in situations where, say, a boy and a girl elf are on the run from some big bad guy, if they decide to get it on while they're running away, they're married. And what's possibly more surprising is that in the Tolkien literature, there's no instances of elves ever having committed adultery or having extramarital affairs. There may be homosexual elves, there certainly is a lot of brotherly love in The Lord of the Rings, but he never mentions it. Also, interspecies sex is pretty rare in Tolkien. There's really only 2 instances of it happening famously. There might be more, but I'm not as big a Tolkien nerd as I could be, for which I'm not entirely disappointed in myself. And in fact, in both situations where an elf did sleep with a human / marry them, it ended pretty disastrously. In the case of Beren and Luthien, there was this huge epic sad song that the elves would sing about them, and in the case of Aragorn and Arwen, well, what you see in the movie, that scene where Elrond says, yeah, in the future Aragorn's gonna die and you're gonna spend the rest of your days completely alone. That's pretty much what happens.
But Arwen went forth from the house, and the light of her eyes was quenched, and it seemed to her people that she had become cold and grey as nightfall in winter that comes without a star.
Rather than just staying in Gondor and being the queen and watching her son grow up, she goes off and lives in Lothlorien all by herself because all the other elves are gone, and she just like sits around in the Golden Wood and is like, damn, my husband's dead, now what? And the strange thing is that when Tolkien talks about humans, he's perfectly open about talking about how, you know, maybe one of the great kings was the son of a rape, and maybe one of the other great kings was the son of an incest. You know, he's pretty open about the sex lives of humans. But when it comes to elves, he pretty much just says, yeah, they come of age, they have sex, and that means they're married, and then they're monogamous, and then they stop having sex when they're older. It's kind of strange, really. Like, if you think that is his ideal of what humanity's sex lives should be, it's interesting, but it's also a little weird. This has been another exciting edition of Everything You Didn't Want to Know About Middle-earth. If you would like to hear more of my voice talking, you should subscribe to this channel, and if you would like to get in contact with me, you can follow me on Twitter at SteveVader101 or on Tumblr, SteveVader101.tumblr.com. Everybody have a beautiful day. Don't forget to be awesome.